He built an empire of lies that shattered lives and shook the financial world to its core. But beyond the headlines and billions lost, what became of Bernie Madoff's soul? Well, in this psychic energy reading, we go beyond the Ponzi scheme to explore the deeper spiritual truth. Had Bernie Madoff had redemption on the other side? Let's find out. Hey guys, I'm Faye and I am a psychic, an energy reader that specializes in post-cognitive readings where I can decode events that have occurred in the past. In addition to that, I am also a medium, and that's very much going to come into play when I connect into Bernie Madoff's energy in the energy reading portion of today's video. Now, before we get into the psychic energy reading portion and the mediumship session, we're first going to begin by exploring some information about Bernie Madoff. Now, in case you're wondering why do I do this if it's ostensibly a psychic energy reading, well, there's a lot to be gleaned from a person's Wikipedia page, and first and foremost sharing what did they do in this lifetime and why are we looking into them at all? So that is very much what we're going to be exploring in this portion. So here we go, some 3D facts about Bernie Madoff that was acquired directly off of his Wikipedia page. Bernard Lawrence Madoff, who was born on April 29th, 1938, and had crossed out of his body on April 14th, 2021, was an American financial criminal and financier who was the admitted mastermind of the largest known Ponzi scheme in history, worth an estimated $65 billion. Madoff's firm had two basic units, a stock brokerage and an asset management business, and the Ponzi scheme was centered in the asset management business portion of it. Now, he had founded a penny stock brokerage in 1960, which eventually grew into the Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. He served as the company's chairman until his arrest on December 11th, 2008. And that very same year, the firm was the sixth largest market maker in S&P 500 stocks. Now, Bernie Madoff also employed a number of his family members, including his brother Peter Madoff, who served as the senior managing director and chief compliance officer, as well as his niece, Shana Madoff, who served as the firm's rules and compliances officer and attorney, as well as his now deceased sons, Mark Madoff and Andrew Madoff. The Madoff investment scandal defrauded thousands, to date 24,000 to be exact, of investors of billions of dollars. And while Madoff had said that he began the Ponzi scheme in the early 1990s, an ex-trader admitted to court to faking records for Madoff since the early 1970s. And those that were charged with recovering the missing money believe that the investment operation may never have been legitimate at all. And how did he defraud 24,000 investors out of billions of dollars? Well, according to an SEC indictment, 2 office workers created false trading reports based on the returns that Madoff ordered for each customer, as in it was a complete fabrication. So, for example, when Madoff determined a customer's return, one of the employees in the back office would enter a false trade report with a previous date and then enter a false closing trade in the amount required to produce the required profit. Now, prosecutors allege that one of the backroom employees had used a computer program specially designed to backdate trades and to manipulate account statements. Now, while Bernie Madoff maintained that he began his fraud in the early 1990s, prosecutors believe that it was underway as early as the 1980s. And an investigator that was charged with reconstructing Madoff's schemes believed that the fraud was well underway as early as 1964. And reportedly, Madoff had told an acquaintance soon after his arrest that the fraud began, quote, almost immediately, end quote, after his firm had opened its doors. Now, you might be wondering, if there was fraud at this magnitude, did nobody in fact know about it or suspect anything? Well, in 1999, a financial analyst named Harry Markopoulos had informed the SEC that he believed it was legally as well as mathematically impossible to achieve the gains that Madoff claimed to deliver. According to Markopoulos, it took him all of 4 minutes to conclude that Madoff's numbers did not add up, and another minute to suspect that they were fraudulent. After hours of failed attempts to replicate Madoff's numbers, Markopoulos believed that he had mathematically proven that Madoff was a fraud. He was ignored by the SEC's Boston office in both 2000 and 2001, as well as the SEC's New York office in 2005 and 2007. He has since co-authored a book in which he details the frustrating efforts he and his legal team had made over a 10-year period to alert the government, the industry, and the press about Madoff's fraud. Now, although Madoff's wealth management business ultimately grew into a multi-billion-dollar operation, none of the major derivative frauds traded with him because they did not believe his numbers were real. Furthermore, none of the major Wall Street firms invested with him, and several high-ranking executives at those firms suspected his operations and claims were not legitimate. Others contended it was inconceivable that the growing volume of Madoff's accounts could be competently and legitimately serviced by his documented accounting and auditing firm, which employed just 3 people with 1 active accountant. For years, Madoff had simply deposited investors' money into his own personal business account, and then he would withdraw money from that account when they had requested a return on their investment. Now, Bernie Madoff lived rather large in life, because when you're stealing $65 billion from other people, why not? So he had lived in a Roslyn, New York ranch through the 1970s. However, in 1980, he purchased an oceanfront residence in Montauk, New York. His primary residence was on Manhattan's Upper East Side. But he also owned a home in France, as well as an 8,700 square foot house in Palm Beach, Florida, where he was a member of the Palm Beach Country Club, where he searched for targets for further fraud. Madoff also owned a 55-foot sports fishing yacht named Bull, maybe for bullshit. But it was not just Bernie Madoff that was living large, because over the years, Madoff's sons had borrowed money from their parents to purchase their own homes as well as other property. So Mark Madoff owed his parents $22 million, and Andrew Madoff owed them $9.5 million. Andrew owned a Manhattan apartment and a home in Greenwich, Connecticut, as his brother Mark prior to his death. And it sounds lovely that both of his sons had multiple homes. However, on the morning of December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years after Bernie Madoff's arrest, his son Mark was found dead in his New York City apartment. The city medical examiner ruled the cause of death as suicide by hanging. Bernie Madoff's other son, Andrew, was diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma, and he eventually succumbed to the illness, and he too had crossed out of his body in 2014. So both Bernie Madoff and his wife, Ruth, lived past both of their children. But perhaps that was not by choice, because according to a 2011 interview on CBS, Ruth Madoff claimed that she and her husband had attempted to unalive themselves after the fraud was exposed, both taking, quote, a bunch of pills, end quote, in an unaliving pack on Christmas Eve in 2008. On December 3rd, 2008, Bernie Madoff had allegedly told his longtime assistant that he was finished. And on December 9th, he allegedly told his brother, Peter, about the fraud. Now, I say allegedly because that's assuming his brother did not know about the fraud prior to that. According to Bernie Madoff's sons, Bernie had told them about the fraud on December 9th. And he had told them that he was finished, that he had absolutely nothing left, and that his investment fund was, quote, just one big lie and basically a giant Ponzi scheme, end quote. According to their attorney, Madoff's sons then reported their father to federal authorities. And on December 11th, 2008, Bernie Madoff was arrested and charged with securities fraud. On June 29th, 2009, Judge Denny Chin sentenced him to the maximum sentence of 150 years in federal prison. Now, Judge Chin had not received any mitigating factor letters from friends or families testifying to Madoff's good deeds, and noted that, quote, the absence of such support was telling, end quote. Judge Chin also said that Madoff had not been forthcoming about his crimes and, quote, I have a sense Mr. Madoff has not done all that he could do or told all that he knows, end quote. Chin also called the fraud extraordinary evil, unprecedented, and staggering, and said that the sentence of 150 years would deter others from committing similar frauds. Judge Chin also noted that Madoff's crimes were off the charts since the federal sentencing guidelines for fraud only go up to $400 million in losses, while Bernie Madoff's were $65 billion. Bernie Madoff was remanded to the Federal Corrections Institute in Butner, North Carolina, and his projected release date was January 34th, 2137, which would require him living to the age of 198 years old. Bernie Madoff had crossed out of his body on April 14th, 2021 due to hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and chronic kidney disease. He was cremated, which is contrary to traditional Jewish customs, and his ashes went unclaimed by his family, and his cremated remains are still in his lawyer's office. 2% personal opinion, I believe he wanted to be cremated and not buried because he did not want there to be any 3D representation of where his remains laid, lest his angry investors go there and curse his soul out ever after. But again, that's just 2% personal opinion. Now, this concludes the 3D exploration according to Bernie Madoff's Wikipedia page, and we will now begin the energy reading into him. Now, before we get into the psychic energy reading, I'm really going to ask you guys for two things. First of all, watch this video all the way through, even if it is not in one sitting, because by his own admission, there are going to be things that are shared you will not like about Bernie Madoff. I don't think that's any surprise to anybody that is watching this. But if you want to get the full expression of what this video is really focusing on, you're going to have to watch the video all the way through. Please trust me on that. If you stop it at any point prior to the very tippy end of this video, you're going to not get a complete picture of what this video is about. So please trust the content creator and watch this video to the very end, even if it is not in one sitting. And lastly, if you are new here, you are going to see me reading from a notebook. It's not because I'm reading a story that somebody else has written. This is literally the goods that the guides had brought to me. This is all my own channeled notes and channeled information. I have approximately 14 pages of notes. There is no way that I will ever remember all of this, which is why I am going to read from it. So if you see me looking down and reading from something, it's my notes from a channeled session. Now, with that in mind, let's dive into the goods that the guides have brought into me. As soon as I had connected to Bernie Madoff's energy, it was shown to me that he always felt dirty. Not in fact because he ran a Ponzi scheme, but because growing up and being a child at the very tail end of the Great Depression and being born to immigrants, hot meals were scarce, clean clothes were scarce, clean bathing water was scarce, and yes, respect was definitely scarce, as in it was non-existent. Immigrants, and especially malnourished, dirty ones, never got respect, and therefore growing up, that's all he had ever wanted. To never again have to worry where his next meal would come from, to worry if he would have to go to sleep hungry again, and if he'd never have to be looked down upon again either. Now, Bernie was certainly not the only child that was born at the tail end of the Depression, nor was he the only child born at that time to immigrants. And he was definitely not the only one to grow up with a chip on his shoulder either, though perhaps he is the most well-known one. And it's probably a good thing that his parents were, I presume, both had crossed over prior to the truth about his business coming to light, because it was also shown to me that they did in fact do the best they could under the circumstances of their life. They tried to shield him from the reality of their circumstances as best they could, but it did not take a genius to know that his family was poor. But then again, so was anybody like them that also lived around them. So it was hard to escape the reality of the family's circumstances despite his parents' best efforts. Now, you might then be wondering, how did Bernie Madoff know there was any other way if this was all his family and in fact his neighborhood had known? Well, contrast, of course. So maybe he didn't realize it right away, but as he grew older and he saw the differences in his clothing and other people's clothing, he would also notice the difference in his neighborhood versus other people's neighborhoods. He also knew the way that people had looked down upon him, and he knew that it made him feel dirty, and that too had reminded him of literally being dirty as a child and taking a bath in already dirty water and then drying his body on an already wet and threadbare towel and then climbing into a cold and lumpy bed with threadbare sheets and hating all of it. And he knew there had to be a better way of living, and he would vow to do anything, absolutely anything, to have it and to live that life. So one could say that Bernie Madoff had developed a rather ruthless streak. And while parts of himself had developed, such as his intellect and his drive, other parts remained frozen in time and remained underdeveloped, such as his empathy. As in, his empathy, so-called empathy, was non-existent. And this might be rather obvious, because how could somebody with empathy swindle thousands of people out of their money or their life savings or their retirements and retain any level of empathy? Well, obviously, they can't. How could said person take all of that money in good consciousness? Well, they couldn't. And that's because Bernie Madoff didn't have a conscience. All he had was this need to put as much distance between himself as an adult and the dirty child that he had been, and the drive to do so, and to do so at absolutely any cost. Any. And a man that would do anything to have money does so at risk to other parts of himself, if those parts were even there in the first place, but which, of course, were not there with Bernie Madoff. So Bernie Madoff, having not developed all parts of himself, would clearly not allow him to be any sort of an energetic match with a fully developed woman, because the energy would be far too incongruent between the two of them. As in, how could they fit together? Well, they couldn't, because they would essentially be like two different pieces from two separate puzzles. So Bernie found himself a girl who was also somewhat underdeveloped, although perfectly nice, albeit a little out to lunch and a little shallow as well. But certainly not somebody that would be any sort of a threat to Bernie, or somebody that would have any desire to look too deeply at Bernie's business dealings either. So essentially, he was looking for somebody that would just want a nice life and be grateful that he could give her one. But also, by marrying a woman who was grateful for what he could give her and wouldn't look too closely or at all at his business, she also wouldn't look too closely at him either. As in, somebody that would either look the other way when he stepped out on her, as in had an affair, or somebody that was out to lunch enough that she just wouldn't notice in the first place. Also, a shallow woman that was given a good life would have an incentive to look the other way anyway. Enter Ruth. She filled all his criteria. She was perfectly nice, albeit a little shallow, a little old-fashioned, so essentially the husband would provide, and the woman would not ask any questions or involve herself in her husband's affairs. So essentially very different from today's husbands and wives, which is why I say old-fashioned, because Ruth was not raised to aspire to be a boss babe. She didn't have to. She was more than happy to let Bernie work, and she would enjoy the life that Bernie could give her. Did Ruth know that Bernie stepped out on her? It doesn't matter, because she was happy and content, because she too was underdeveloped. So she did not want nor have the capacity for a deep relationship because she herself wasn't particularly deep either. She had what she had. She had what Bernie could give of himself, and later in life, she had a really nice life living off of other people's money, and she did not want more. Now, did Ruth know that she was living off of other people's money because Bernie ran a Ponzi scheme? No, I don't think she did, nor do I in fact think that she cared where the money came from, as long as she could continue to live the way that she had gotten used to, because that's all that mattered to her. Again, she was not a very deep woman. Now, although Bernie absolutely did step out on the side, as in he had multiple affairs during the course of his marriage to her, it was also shown to me that he was good to her. Of course, that's outside of the fact that he was also cheating on her. But as in to say he was good to her because he was not abusive, he was not a miser with the money that he had stolen, and he did provide a nice life for her. But despite being good to her, he absolutely did, throughout the course of the marriage, have many numerous affairs that lasted varying amounts of time depending on how frequently he would see the woman that he was having an affair with. But he never wanted it to be too long or until the woman stopped looking up to him. Because again, remember, what spurred him on was feeling that he was looked down upon. So he would treat the woman well. He gave them extravagant gifts, met them in 5-star hotels, but he never promised them anything. So Bernie Madoff did not pitch them a sob story about being in a loveless marriage and wanting to leave his wife and thus stringing them along for years while they would wait for that all to happen. No. It was strictly sex, and he always knew that the woman knew where he stood. As in, he was married, he would not be leaving his wife, and if they two wanted something casual, well, he was there for it. But that's all it was, and that's all it would ever be, because if they wanted something more, this was something that he could not give to them. and he could not bear them not looking up to him, which is why he had treated them well and given them rather extravagant gifts. Now I'm talking diamond earrings, but not the ones that are so small that you needed a magnifying glass to see them, but more like diamond earrings that were 1 or 2 carats in size, as well as a matching solitaire diamond necklace. So Bernie Madoff delighted in spoiling his mistresses because of the look in their eyes when he did, and how it would make him feel. So when they looked up to him, he felt a million miles away from the skinny child that was born to a family of immigrants, and with that, he felt free from his past. But also he came to the realization this affair with whatever woman he was having the affair with was not something that could forever be sustained, because eventually even casual sex became stale and even luxury gifts would not excite them any longer. And that's when he knew that he would have to end the affair. As in, end it before it fell apart and the woman would look at him like he was just another man and not, in fact, a god among them. Now, this is not to say that Bernie Madoff really thought that he was a god, because no, he was not delusional. But he wanted to set himself apart and treat women in a way that no other man had treated them before. That's in fact why he would never lie to them, why he would never lead them on, and why he certainly spoiled them. But it could not last forever, and with that, he would sit them down and let them know. So essentially, Bernie Madoff was not a ghoster. He sat them down and he let them know it was time to end the casual affair. And sometimes there were tears because, really, as much as a woman says that she's down with casual sex, the act of sex alone tends to develop feelings because it's in fact how women are hardwired. But he was gentle with them, never said that it had anything to do with them, and he had always sent them flowers the next day with a gift certificate to a spa or something like that, just to lessen the blow. And then Bernie Madoff would throw himself back into his work and the art of closing a lucrative but also ludicrous deal that was always too good to be true for the investor. But that's always exactly what had drawn them in. Greed, he concludes, is what had drawn them in. And then he said, "Ha! People think he was the greedy one?" he asked me rhetorically. Sure, he acknowledges, what he did was a crime, but he also points out that he only took advantage of other people's greed, and he had no doubt that had they, as in the investor, had the drive, the motivation, or the intelligence to pull off what he had done, they too would have done the same because they were greedy. Greedy, but also lazy, which is why they invested their money with him, even though the return on investment was always too good to be true, because again, he points out, greed. But he says to me rather indignantly, "But the world punishes the ones bold enough to actually do something about their desires and coddles the ones that are too afraid to?" And then he points out to me, they were all at the same party, weren't they? They all danced the same dance, didn't they? So essentially, Bernie Madoff is using different words to say what I always say, which is that Bernie Madoff and his investors were a direct vibrational match for one another. But no matter, he concluded, he had a good life, and he had a loyal wife, and he had had a lot of really nice things. But in the end, once he was out of his body, he realized none of it had mattered. Horrible as it sounds, he acknowledged, and especially to his victims that are still alive. But once he was on the other side, he realized none of it, in fact, had ever really mattered, because he had seen that this was all a soul contract. As in, he agreed prior to being born to do the things that he had done. And to him, seeing it was just the most remarkable thing. To have the ability, once he was on the other side, to see that he had chosen to be born to the parents that he had been chosen to, because they would shape him, and to the poor home that would haunt him, and the dirty baths and the dirty feeling that clung to him. He also shared that he had seen that although he had retained his free will, and that at any point he could have made a different choice that could have changed his path, the parents he had chosen to be born to was in fact to serve as the impetus that his soul needed to do the things that he had been soul contracted to do. As in Bernie Madoff had recognized, as the cosmic creator of the life experience he had in this most recent lifetime, he agreed prior to being born, he was going to be a thief. He was going to commit the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of mankind. And just like he was soul contracted to do this, even though he retained his free will, guess what? All of his victims were also soul contracted to him that this was going to happen to them as well. Because I remind you, anything that happens that is so big and notable in somebody's life, including being swindled out of their life savings or their retirement, that's not chance, that's a soul contract. So all of his victims were soul contracted to Bernie Madoff, just as Bernie Madoff was soul contracted to his victims. And he further concluded he was also soul contracted to be born to his parents, because that experience would serve as the impetus to drive him to fulfill his soul contract and do what he had chosen to come here to do, to be a thief, to be a liar, to be a bastard. And in fact, even to treat his mistresses better than the clients that he had cheated out of their own money, and then to turn around and use that money to pay for the gifts for his mistresses. And also, he concluded, it was to choose a woman as a wife who would be loyal to him but never be a threat to him, because perhaps had he married a better woman, then he too would have been a better man. Maybe he would have even been an honest man. But he had shared, once he was on the other side, he had not been a good nor an honest man. And then lastly, after he had seen his life, and he had seen the soul contracts, and he had seen his soul lessons, and he had seen his life as if it was a movie, because yes, once we are out of our body and on the other side, we have all of these afterlife experiences where we can kind of like unpack our life. One of them being seeing your life as if it's a movie and without any of the emotional attachment to it. So yes, once he had seen his soul contracts and his soul lessons, but before being with God to be healed, his sons had come to him, and he had seen how they were really like two pillars. And they were pillars that could have been for good and of good had he himself not been a rotten man who had used everyone around him, including his own sons, for his own gain. But instead, he had used them as pillars, holding up his house of cards, which was built on greed and betrayal. And then Bernie Madoff had shared with me that had he been alive, he'd have bawled his eyes out dry to see how he had in fact used his own sons, nevertheless acknowledging that it was also a soul contract between himself and his sons, but still. How could any father bear the grief that he had caused to the ones closest to him? How could he bear the grief that he had caused to the ones that he had sworn to take care of and to protect? And imagine, he had shared with me, how arrogant as to think that he himself and his clients were exactly alike and that they had all been driven by greed. Because Bernie Madoff had concluded perhaps his clients' greed was to secure a better future for their own sons when Bernie Madoff had used his own sons for the betterment of his own life and his own future. And that was a big wake-up call for him. And with that, he could finally see the absolute terror and nightmare that he had become, and why his sons had come to him before he himself had been healed by God. Because Bernie Madoff concluded he needed to see all of the hurt. He needed to see all of the chaos and all that he had done. Yes, by soul contracts, but still, because he retained his free will. So he had to see all of that. So that way, when he met with God, he could give it all to God and he could be cleansed of all of it. As in cleansed of his sins, his choices, his greed, his corruption, and all the darkness that had resided inside of him. And then once Bernie Madoff had seen that all, did he feel anything remotely worthy of God's love, of God's grace, of the right to even be in God's presence after being a wicked, wicked man? No, not at all. Not even remotely did he feel worthy of being with God. And he thought to fall on his knees and beg forgiveness of God, but found once he was with God, all he felt was love. No judgment, just such overwhelming love that he didn't understand how it was possible that so much love existed and how all of that love was so freely given to him, a self-proclaimed bastard. But it was freely given to him. And all of that love that was so freely given to him and directed to him broke him apart, so that way he could be filled with it, rebuilt with it, and rebuilt from it until he was whole once more. But this time, not as in he had a hole, H-O-L-E, but as in he was whole, W-H-O-L-E, and he was complete. And once he had been given all of that love freely, and he was complete, Bernie shared with me that he understood why in life some people choose to be assistants to gurus or wise men, even if it meant fixing their meals or even washing their feet. because there was beauty in being of service to someone holier and wiser than you. That there is in fact much to learn from those that have more to give when they live in service of others and to humanity than those that seek to take it away from others, just as he had. That's how he feels being with God, as in he realizes he has much to learn. And he wishes to stay besides God forever and to be at peace in a way that he never knew existed when he had been alive. But also knowing that he never would have been able to appreciate the peace he now has without the chaos he first caused in life, because contrast. And though God has never once said anything or given a look that says, "Go on now, little one, you have much to learn and many other lifetimes to learn it in," every once in a while, he gets that thought and he thinks, maybe, just maybe, he could do it again. As in, maybe he could come back again and have another go around. But maybe this time not be such a bastard. Maybe even in this next lifetime, he'll come in to sit at the feet of a guru and to serve this time. Maybe even live in service to humanity this next time, because wouldn't that be good? Because maybe this next time around, he could be good. So that concludes the psychic energy reading into Bernie Madoff. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this, perhaps found it to be insightful or thought-provoking. I remind you to please take what resonates, leave the rest behind. And as always, and until next time, stay in that high vibration.